With his latest documentary, Jazz, Ken Burns, it's once again taking on a uniquely American subject. The creator of documentaries on the Civil War and baseball has this time constructed a series on the art form that gave us Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. The film also uses jazz as a prism to explore such subjects as race, sexuality, and the rise of the American city in the 20th century. Time magazine wrote this week, quote, "Nothing else on television has ever sounded as good as jazz. It is great television about great music." Here is a scene from the series.
Jazz, the drummer Art Blakey liked to say, washes away the dust of everyday life. Above all, it swings.
Jazz premieres on PBS stations January 8th. The 10 episodes will air throughout the month. Joining me now, Ken Burns, the director and producer of the series, and Wynton Marsalis, jazz musician and senior creative consultant for the film. I'm pleased to have both of them here. Congratulations.
Thank you.
This is unbelievable. And you too. I mean, this is a story that you must have dreamed would be told.
Definitely.
Dreamed. Growing up, I mean.
Well, much later.
Yeah,
Not so much
later.
when I grew up, because I didn't know the history of it either, but later, after, when I was in my 20s, yeah, definitely.
What is it, notwithstanding that you played a part, but what is it that you think makes this? What is it that we get from this that you think is important to tell?
I think the sense of the people that made the music are unencumbered by the cliches that have always attended the discussion of their achievements. And really the pacing of it, so much went into making it. He had a whole army of people up in Walpole. I mean, it was unbelievable going to the house, you know. And also you get to hear the musicians play.
Yeah, you do.
You get to hear them. You get to hear Charlie Parker play. You get to hear Monk. You get to hear Louis Armstrong. You get to.
What is amazing for me is that it is a continuum, and there were relationships. And you double back sometimes. We'll introduce a character, and then later we'll find more about how she knew what the relationships were, how these people played together, how one built on what the other had done, how one decided to go in a whole different direction. But they knew each other. This is a community of people over a period of time, knew and learned from each other.
Absolutely. I mean, we have a situation here where when you try to describe music, it's almost impossible. It's like trying to get the soap in the bathtub. And I think telling a narrative story, being wedded to finding out about human beings, means you're obligated to a very complex narrative which plants a seed in episode 2 about Artie Shaw that's not going to really pay dividends until episode 5, when Artie Shaw is struggling with his own success and the commercialization of swing. But you understand that as he goes through his early biography, he's going and hearing Louis Armstrong at the Savoy in Chicago and hearing him play West End blues, and that's going to change the way Artie Shaw is. Artie Shaw at one point in our film says that I had a choice. He said, I wasn't happy with my life. I had a choice between getting a machine gun or getting an instrument, and he got an instrument.
Wow.
And that's the sort of story you want to tell, the kind of connection that you want to forge with it.
Some are describing this as Ken Burns' American trilogy, Civil War, baseball, and jazz.
It is, and I wish I could say I planned it from the beginning. I did the Civil War. It's the defining moment in American history. As I was working on baseball, I realized that I was working on the sequel to baseball, which sort of surprised me, that the Civil War defined us. We tend to see our history as a political military narrative, you know, wars and generals and presidents, and that's it. And we forget that so much of who we are comes from other things that are going to ooze out of things like baseball, you know, race, the nature of heroes, popular culture and advertising, great cities, you know, all the wonderful things that baseball carries along in its wake. Two things happened while I was working on baseball that convinced me that it wasn't this moment and a sequel. I gave a speech about the Civil War, and Wynton was sitting in the front row, and after it was done, it's like 91, just after the Civil War came out, he said, you know, you should do something about jazz. And I kind of went, yeah.
This was 91?
91. You should do something about jazz. And I'd been using jazz music. I didn't know much about it. I'm a child of rock and roll and R&B. And I worked in a record store for 4 years, and I knew all this stuff, but it wasn't my music. But I was beginning to use jazz more and more as the soundtrack to all these American subjects. It was working. It is our soundtrack. So he says that thing. Then we do an interview with Gerald Early in baseball. This unbelievable thing he says that works its way into the introduction of baseball. He said that when they study our American civilization 2,000 years from now, we Americans will be known for only three things: the Constitution, baseball, and jazz music. And I'm going, he's saying that the genius of this country is in improvisation. Constitution's 4 pieces of paper, that's it. Baseball's a simple children's stick and ball game with infinite chess-like combinations. And at the heart of the only art form Americans have invented is this notion that I do not have to play the notes on the page. I can play who I am, and in telling you honestly who I am, that will be the art, and that will be an amazing American art. And when you realize that the themes that I've been interested in, particularly race, are all brought along. Because the great, wonderful poetic justice of jazz is that the only art form Americans have invented that will commend us down through the years to posterity in the best light is a music born primarily in a community that has the historical memory of being unfree in a supposedly free land. You know, as Wynton says in the film, it's the story of Cinderella. The person that you keep out of the ball, keeps away, is going to end up being the belle of the ball. And that what jazz affords us is an opportunity to touch not only the soul of our country, but what we might become when we live out, as Dr. King said, the true meaning of our creed. So it was a trilogy that insinuated itself and said, you have to do it. And so by '94, when I was finishing baseball, where jazz music made those central episodes of the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s come alive, the trilogy was in place.
As you make these films, what's changing other than the subject? I mean, you're older, you're more experienced, but does anything change? You're telling stories about something that is uniquely American through the visual elements that are possible and through the voices that are available.
I give up. You found out my secret. That's it. I've been making the same film over and over again. I've been asking this deceptively simple question, who are we? You know, somebody asked me, what are you working on now today? And I said, I'm working on Mark Twain. And I thought, you know, well, jazz is about the nature of America, the nature of American creativity, and race, among many other things. Would you agree?
Yes, of course.
Well, Mark Twain is about the nature of America, the nature of American creativity, and about race, among many, many other things. So in some ways, it's the same field we're plowing, but each story affords a different perspective. It's like spokes on a wheel. You want to get into whatever that nub is of information, and you can go at it different ways. Just like, you know, art's not the only way in. We invent religion, we have science. We've chosen within art that there's this documentary film style that you can sort of pursue these questions, these American questions.
We're going to see in a minute Louis Armstrong. The 2 greatest jazz artists from America are Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. No, yes, it's debatable, it doesn't matter.
It doesn't really matter, but they're great. I mean, they're at the top of the food chain. You're not going to go no higher than them.
Yeah. Nobody's above them. Nobody's above them.
Yeah, nobody's above them.
Somebody may be with them, but nobody's above them.
Right.
Having said that, from your own brain, tell me about Louis Armstrong. Tell me about Pops.
Just an original, a man of a deep spiritual feeling, the highest level of musical intelligence. He grew up around a lot of great trumpet players, and he played a lot better than all of them. He played what they wanted to play. And he never lost, he understood that the value of humility. He knew he was a genius, but he understood the value of humility in terms of always learning and taking things in. He took in a lot of love, he gave out a lot of love. And it's just an unbelievable presence. And everybody imitated him at one point, singers, instrumentalists. He just represented something so great. McCoy Tyner once told me, man, Louis Armstrong was a king.
That's what I
So,
meant.
you know, that's what he said.
And if he said it.
He said, you figure McCoy was playing with Coltrane. They were playing modal music, and it's supposed to be so ultra-modern. He said when Louis Armstrong came to see them in Chicago, that they were so nervous they almost couldn't play. So then between the sets, he and Elvin and everybody greeted Pops, Louis Armstrong, and Pops said, yeah, you boys got good tones. He said, it made us feel so good, you know, whether he liked our music or not.
See, that tells a story that I love so much. He's coming to see Coltrane, and they all know, so many of this story is connected.
Right.
And if you do a thematic approach, then you have to separate jazz and segregate it into everybody's style. And you can't figure out how Charlie Parker is connected to Louis Armstrong. But when you tell an American story, then you know exactly how Charlie Parker is connected to Armstrong.
Roll tape, a scene from episode 4, The True Welcome, about the influence of Louis Armstrong.
He was the first to refer to a musician's skills as his chops. The first to call people cats. When he couldn't remember someone's name, he'd call them Gate or Pops. Pops would become the fond nickname his friends around the world called him.
How does jazz mirror the African-American experience?
Well, in many ways, first the organization of the ensemble, the people all improvising off of a bass, which is something that's African in origin. Then in the ability to take a thing that's a standard and change it. The best example today would be something like basketball. And what Naismith invented is not what Michael Jordan and them were doing. They took the fundamentals and they changed it and improvised it and made it much better through showing how you could use your skill and your personality and your originality to inside of the boundaries that are set to expand the limits and the possibilities. So you look at it and say, like the skyscraper. You knew that we could build buildings, but you didn't know they could go up 50 stories. So you say, oh man, is that what's possible? Charlie Parker, as a musician, when you hear him play the saxophone, and people could play the saxophone, but
not like
they
that.
never could just that fast, that quick, that many.
That's what it was. It was so
ideas.
fast and so quick and so to a different.
It's just the Afro-American people had to adapt to the circumstances in America, and also the element of competition. When you have someone telling you all the time you can't, and making it so that you can't compete, and you have an arena that you can compete in, and that arena is music. Whereas you could have been the greatest in baseball, but you weren't going to play with the whites. Or in business, or in any of the other fields. If you're a doctor, you're going to be a black doctor. But in music, that wax. And all of these things that existed. Somebody playing on the radio, you couldn't segregate the airwaves.
Or someone said, wax knows no color.
It knows no color. And the trumpet, when Louis Armstrong started playing, trumpet players all over the world wanted to know, man, how does he play that? And people had to tell him, wait a second, he's a we don't like him. But if you're a trumpet player, you say, well, you don't like him, but I play trumpet.
I like him.
Whereas in business, you know, you wouldn't see him.
So he says in 1991, jazz. Why does it take until 2001 for this to appear on the air?
Well, it's taken 6 years to make the thing, and I was in the middle of baseball, or the beginning of baseball when we met, and it wasn't really till I was most of the way through baseball that I actually knew. I mean, the head decides, but it's not until the heart decides that you're actually going to commit 6 years to doing something like this. And it was coming to the end of baseball and realizing that I could not do it. I mean, people say, how do you choose your topics? I said, they choose me. I mean, this music came up and just said, you have to know about it. And it's better for me if it's a process of discovery. If I tell you what I know, it's going to operate at one level. If I share with you what I've discovered, and I meet new friends, and I make new friends, and I talk to all these people, and work with somebody like Jeff Ward, who's been, so unbelievable, the great writer of this, then there's a possibility that the 6 years, by the time it comes out, is really about something.
But when this is a no-brainer, isn't it, to do jazz? I mean, because you've got music, you've got great stories. What could be a possible reservation about taking this journey? No reservation. You just didn't know that it would take 6 years?
Except that, no, I knew exactly it would take 6 years. In fact, I predicted, almost to the day when we would put the thing out. But it's having the courage, this is a huge undertaking to take what is essentially 1,000 hours of stuff that we collected and trying to winnow it down and tell the stories in 10 episodes across 150, 200 years of American history.
I don't want to flatter you, but it is amazing that this young white filmmaker who had no great grounding in jazz could come up with something that most people that
I had help.
love. I know you did. But that's something, doesn't it?
It's not amazing. His race is not what makes it amazing. This is 2000. It would have been amazing in 1870. Well, they didn't have to do it. It would have been amazing in 1930, but I mean, he's a great filmmaker. He knows how.
I don't mean about race as much as about experience with jazz. You know.
Well, he's very diligent. He got everybody in rooms. I mean, this is like a serious undertaking. He's so serious and diligent, and works. He burns the midnight oil, and he's very serious. And this is a point that I always make, even though it seems like it's so simple that it's almost a put down, but the desire to do the amount of work with integrity, to get people of different viewpoints. He has people in the film, like he has people that don't get along with each other, different viewpoints being presented. He's balancing a lot of information. He has his vision that he's adhering to. And what it takes to weave all of these things together and create something like this is really an unbelievable feat of balance and an unbelievable amount of work. And you know, that's what he's known for doing that. So I knew when he said he would do it, that it would be the greatest thing ever done on jazz. There was never any doubt.
When I decided to do it, the first thing I did is I went to Wynton.
Is that
and
right?
I said,
first call is?
First call.
It had to be because he...
Well, I went over to his apartment and I just said, I want to do something on jazz. He said, I'll do whatever you want. And I said, I'd like it very much if you could like submit to an interview. It won't take too long. He said, I'll do whatever you want. I said, and maybe you could be in a consult. He said, you're not listening to me. I'll do whatever you want. And I have to tell you that was the best trip I made because, as you know, Wynton suffuses this series and brings to it, I mean, talk about integrity and diligence. That's, you know, you can pick that up from this man.
But there were a lot of people involved, you know. Like I said, we went up to New Hampshire. It was a whole house of people working day and night. Everybody's like a huge enterprise, and they're working for years on this.
Yeah.
And his ability to, how he fixes it. One thing is done a certain way, and they say, oh, we don't know about this. You come back and you see it. It's a totally different thing. The decisions that he makes are such great understanding of form, the form that he's dealing with.
Let me see a clip and I'll come back. This is a look at Louis Armstrong singing as seen in episode 4, The True Welcome. Here it is.
Is anyone finer in the state of Carolina? If there is, then you know, show to me. Dinah, the Dixie blazing, we love the city gazing to the eyes of Dinah Lee. Baby, every night, one eye, shake with fine, cause my dynamite, change your mind,
In the history of music, a line that you and Jeffrey Ward insisted to be on there.
I looked at this. I remember Jeffrey showed this to me, and he said, I want to show you some stuff. And it's like in the early days, I have to sort of stay distanced from stuff. I have to just collect this material with a kind of dispassion. You want to go, Someone said, look at this great photograph I found. Yeah, that's nice. Listen to this great song, And it's not until you work with it later does it become yours, and I will now, you know, step in front of a car to protect that thing. But then it was like, and Jeff said, I think you want to see this. And we looked at this piece of music, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I went right to the screen and went up to it. Louis Armstrong's changed my life, not just as a filmmaker, but as a person. You are looking at the epitome of modernness. Nobody can sing like that now. This is a man on the level of the Wright brothers, Freud, Einstein, Picasso, Stravinsky. He is rearranging the molecules of jazz and American music in that moment, and nothing will be the same afterward. I think it may be, you know, with the Zapruder film and the Hindenburg blowing up, like some of the greatest frames of film footage in all of American history. And I've seen it 500 times, and it never fails to make me feel better about being alive.
Because it was a perfect moment of using...
This man, and Wynton can tell you better, this man single-handedly just about transformed jazz from an ensemble music into a soloist art, inventing, for lack of a better word, what the critic Gary Giddens called modern time, or what we call swing. In fact, the early days of swing, they didn't call it swing, they called it orchestrated Armstrong. Duke Ellington heard him, he said, I want Louis Armstrong playing on every instrument. And then he went and changed the way people sang, before and ahead of the note, with this joyous invention that does, my own mortality, I've said this a few times, is anxiety about mortality, is tempered by the idea that someday I'm going to get to hear Louis Armstrong, if I'm good, get to hear Louis Armstrong blow Gabriel out of the clouds, and that will make it all worthwhile. I cannot say enough about what Louis Armstrong does for me, but also what I think he's done for all of us.
Where'd you find that footage?
It's around. It's been around. Wynton's known it for years, and
has the same impact on you?
On anybody who sees it. because we have the 20th century, the early 20th century fascination with the primitive rhythms and the sophistication, like what we see in the Rite of Spring or Picasso, Damsel d'Avignon, that was a preoccupation. In Louis Armstrong, you have the most sophisticated musician with the most unerring ear and the most perfect taste, who has the type of understanding of the very lowest levels of human engagement and the very highest levels. And his eyes are always on the spiritual ascendance of people. And it's so perfectly fused. Now the song that he was singing, Dinah, goes, Dinah, is there anyone finer? Do in the state of Carolina. The people sing that song very straight. This man comes out and goes, Dinah, is there anyone finer? In the state of Carolina, if she is, let me know what you heard him sing. He just starts all of the stuff that's so perfectly transforms that into, he's talking about somebody that you know now. He's not singing a song. He's telling you something about Dinah. And you're saying, man, where does this come from? Like people used to say, Coleman Hawkins said when he first heard Louis Armstrong play, you wonder where a guy like that comes from. Yeah. It's just, or Doc Cheatham once told me, he said, man, this man has something inside of him that no other man has. It's just something from God, and you're just glad to be hearing it and know what you're hearing.
Yeah. When we were making this film, we did many, many interviews. 75 are in the film. Probably 50 people that we interviewed talked about Armstrong. Everybody says essentially the same thing. Whatever area, faction of jazz you're in, they all basically agree that Armstrong is so central to it. But it's interesting that not just friends and families and musicians that played with him, but musicians now and sober critics and writers and historians all say the same thing. He was a gift from God or an angel. And you stop. After a while, you hear this 50 times from people like Gary Giddens, who says he played to make the angels weep. Or Wynton, he says he's a messenger to deliver this. You start hearing this stuff about it. This film, this man, Wynton, Louis Armstrong in jazz, taught me a really important lesson, that we live in a media culture. Everything is always black and white, yes or no, won or lost, up or down. And we yearn, we palpably yearn in our lives, in our spirits, for some mitigating wisdom, some reconciling wisdom that sees both sides of it, right? Jazz sees both sides of it. Right. Louis Armstrong sees both sides of it. And so that we have, our popular music is all about sex, right? I mean, that's all that it's about. But they're not going to tell you about sex. Britney Spears is going to lead you to the bedroom door, but then she doesn't prepare you for anything. Madonna's documentary is Truth or Dare, but it's all dare, it's not truth. If you want to know about sex, then you have to go to Duke Ellington or Miles Davis. Then you really find out what you need to know.
Speaking of Duke Ellington, take a look at this scene from episode 3, Our Language About Duke Ellington's Gift.
He knew the orchestra so well, the colors of each instrument, but not just an instrument. To Duke, a trumpet was not just a trumpet, it was an individual. A saxophone was not just an instrument, but it was a person.
Tell me about Duke.
Those voices that we just heard the saxophones play. A tireless worker, and just so comprehensive in his art, created original things with under blistering criticism for many years. Ignorance, especially his later years, just ignorance, and he had but always ascendant and never allowing himself to be condescended up to. He was always, I'm Duke Ellington, and he worked on the music. He did what it took to keep that orchestra going. Unbelievable psychologist, unbelievable musician, just a lover of the boudoir song. And like all of the jazz musicians, they all have that combination of soul and intelligence and a deep feeling for this country and a deep feeling for people and a deeper spiritual understanding of the nature of things in the real sense, not allowing the convention of their upbringing or of the society to make them blind to what they could open their eyes and see so plainly and clearly. And since I grew up around jazz musicians, that's what I always knew. I didn't actually like their music, but what I liked was the feeling that came out of these people. And Duke Ellington represented the very highest levels of thought. And when you study his music or you look at his scores, they're so clearly written. I'll never forget when I first went to the Smithsonian and actually looked at how much music he wrote. Because a lot of times you think that your band got together and they just had, he wrote out a melody and they started playing harmonies. I don't know what these crazy things we would think. Man, when I saw how much work this man had done on his music, And just the volume of it, draw after draw after draw after draw of music written in this same very clear, concise hand. He was just an unbelievable believer in our music, in his music, in blues, and in the individual's ability to express themselves. First, the individual soloistic way, like in Louis Armstrong style, but also the other part is in an ensemble sense. Because Louis Armstrong, many times we say he was the soloist. Okay, he was a great soloist. But one of his greatest early achievements was playing inside of the ensemble with King Oliver, playing second cornet, which is a support role. And he supported King Oliver with such unbelievable ability and clarity that he was not only a great soloist, he was a phenomenal ensemble player. So Duke Ellington, he and Louis Armstrong together give us both things that are the mandates of a democratic citizen: your rights and your responsibilities.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. The tension between the individual and the collective, and both men negotiated it perfectly. Perfectly.
When you put this together, do you end with Ellington essentially?
We have a shot. Ellington is actually the last shot of the film, but essentially our narrative goes up to 1974 when Duke Ellington died, and then we unhitch the narrative, and our last 40 minutes of the film is a kind of impressionistic celebration of the last 25 years of jazz, something I did quite consciously from the very beginning, because I'm in the business of history, and history is about stories that are over. And the current contemporary scene, what's been going on for the last 25 years, are stories that are still ongoing. And so I can't presume to tell the present what it's about yet, because we lack that historical distance, that historical perspective. So what we found was that the death of Armstrong, the death of Ellington, and then in 1975, Miles Davis saying himself that jazz was dead, the music of the museum, and we take that nadir to then stop and bring us back joyously to the present, where it is not dead, as he says, we are still alive and swinging, and celebrate the diversity. But that's really for us about as comfortable as we can get to the present with our kind of dominant, controlling narrative that we've developed since the get-go, episode 1.
All right, let me talk about swing, because in the early you get into this notion of the popularity of swing and how that happened. Roll tape. This is from episode 5, Swing, Pure Pleasure.
Swing rescued the recording industry. In 1932, just 10 million records had been sold in the United States. By 1939, that number would grow to 50 million.
Let me talk about some names, too. We've mentioned some of them here. Charlie Parker.
I think he's the most influential revolutionary, with the exception of Armstrong, in the history of jazz music. Compositionally, it's Ellington, and it's Mingus, and it's Thelonious Monk, to my opinion. But I think when you talk about somebody who just upended the music, rearranged molecules, and was such a complex and interesting human being, it's not just the music, and this man could play, as Wynn said. You just hear it, and you stop and you listen. But his story of his life is so compelling, and so fascinating, and so light, and so dark, and so American, that how could you not be drawn irresistibly to it, like a moth to a flame? I mean, Parker is something else.
Man, Charlie Parker, just the speed of thought.
He changed things.
It's not just that he changed them, he changed them for the better. The speed of his thinking. You can't believe a man can think that fast and execute something so perfectly. Like the great John Lewis told me. He said, man, you couldn't throw out a note. John Lewis said he would go to, there's a great pianist who's a music director of the Modern Jazz Quartet for many years, said he would go to a club and he would be trying to get out the door and Charlie Parker would start playing. He'd just have to stand there all night and just like Mozart or something.
Yeah.
What would you change? Nothing.
Here's a small part of this series as well. You learn that Charlie Parker was what do we know about him? We knew he was a great musician.
Right.
And we knew he was a heroin addict. That's all we knew. Most of what we knew. And some relationship. Great reader.
Unbelievable.
Unbelievable
Great mind.
Curiosity.
Yeah.
Great mind. Great reader.
Yeah, the musicians always said that. First thing, if you knew jazz musicians, the first thing you know is how intelligent almost all of the jazz musicians. They don't have to be Charlie Parker, let alone him. the level of intelligence, of curiosity, of having traveled around the world and being well read, understanding how things work. That's one thing that our country has truly been cheated out of, that relationship with musicians of that quality of intelligence and engagement. And all the musicians say Charlie Parker was by far the most. Say, man, he could teach you how to fix your car, or he could. You'd be talking to him, be talking to some guy about...
The trap is that when you say improvisation and spontaneous, they think that you're dealing with sort of a natural talent, that Parker's is just this big bear of a guy who's going to pick up this thing and blow. This is what the beat generation sort of misread about bebop, when in fact you're looking at the speed of thought. You cannot believe that somebody can go that fast and play that stuff and not have
and have it be so logical. Monk. When you study their souls and you understand that just the logic of it, the way it's constructed, so mathematically perfect, and there's so many, it's like a labyrinth of, it's really unbelievable, the spiritual connection. Like Dizzy Gillespie one time told me, he said, man, Charlie Parker, those are some deep notes he played.
Is that what he said?
Those are some deep notes he played. They came from somewhere else. Like the depth of a note. It's almost like the voice of a person. Like you hear King's voice. He's using words we all use. But the depth of the voice, the depth of engagement with your condition. With your condition, not just his. He's talking to you and you feeling, yeah, man, Charlie Parker. That's what he added to that legacy.
In the Civil War series, at the end of the first inauguration, Abraham Lincoln turns to everybody. He says, "We must not be enemies, we must be friends. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." Then he says this unbelievably poetic line for President. He says, "The mystic chords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave." But it's C-H-O-R-D-S. There is a kind of music of the spirit in this country that Lincoln had, that King had, that Armstrong had, that Ellington had, that Parker had, that so many, that this man has, that we are all better. We're vibrating that much finer. I mean, we're talking about the transforming of coarse materials into fine materials. That's what jazz music does.
Miles Davis.
Very complicated figure.
I know.
But I think that the show, a lot of things were revealed about Miles, where he grew up, what his father did to get him off of drugs. I mean, a lot of things, even though I was very familiar with his story and knew him and talked to him many times, sometimes on more friendly terms than others, but some of the things that I saw here was, maybe I'd heard the story, but seeing the images gave me a much clearer understanding. But
of where he was coming from?
Where he was coming from and what he went through. But he was another guy that was very serious in his time of being serious. Like he once told me when he first came to New York that Fats Navarro, who was a great trumpet player, used to make him stand next to him, and would be playing so much horn that he couldn't believe it. And just last night I was having a conversation with Herbie Hancock, and he said, man, Miles would tell me things, and it might be 10 or 15 years before I would understand what he was telling me, and how he could take songs and transform them in a type, once again, of intelligence that he had. He said being a Buddhist, Herbie being a Buddhist, allowed him to come to grips with a lot of the spiritual conceptions that Miles Davis laid out for him, not in the context of religion. So these are men with a very deep thought and original sounds. And Miles Davis put the mute in or play one of those ballads, and just the sound is so enveloping and warm and mystic. Speaking of mystic chords, a sound with a memory that comes from a long time ago, but it's very modern also. And Miles was a part of that tradition of the great individualists like he and Dizzy and Monk, and the fact that all these people were around each other together. Charlie Parker, they were all on the bandstand. They talked with each other. They saw each other. They fought each other. But they loved that music. Right. Like Dizzy said, man, we played this music day and night. You want to know why we sounded good? That's why we be playing right now.
The thing that goes along with this reconciling force is the thing that I've taken away, and particularly from Davis, I think, and also Coltrane, is a sense of honesty. I mean, these are people who are willing to put themselves up into a moment which the rest of us have no understanding of, this idea of creating on the spot. And what they have to bring is themselves, however they find themselves at that moment. And what's so great about Miles is that he's able to take all of the demons, all of the advantages, all of the musical deficits. It wasn't, he couldn't play as fast with the same sort of technical virtuosity and speed of a Gillespie or a Parker. At first. But he made the notes count. So he dealt with that. He dealt with it, and he brought Miles, and Miles seems to be a whole bunch of stuff that we can respond to sexually, we can respond to emotionally, we can respond to physically, we can respond to just technically. I mean, there's moments in his music that no one has ever played better than he has played.
Definitely. And the jazz is such a rich field that once he realized that he was not going to play fast like Dizzy when he was 19, 20, 21, there's Lester Young, there's Billie Holiday. There's other people with another concept, and Miles was also a student of the history of jazz. So instead of getting tied into being a modernist, he went back to styles that featured a quarter note, a more basic unit. He started to construct his style like an old-time trumpet player, but he could still play the things that came from Dizzy Gillespie. And he was curious about a lot of different kinds of music. So, you know, we're dealing with figures and people who is just such richness and difference of experiences that they teach you how to respect the differences in people. Right. Like you stand in front of an elementary school class to teach that class. If you know about Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Charlie Parker, Thelonious Monk, all these great individuals exist. When you look at each and every one of those students, you don't have you go from a standard model of behavior to accepting the individuality of each one of these individuals. Okay, this one doesn't like to talk long. This one is shy. This one is very flamboyant. And this one is, and you learn to love and respect the full range of what's available.
We've been talking about this throughout this conversation. If you look at the great jazz artists, I want to come to Billie Holiday and some of the vocalists in a moment, but if you look at the great jazz artists, what do they share with the great people of baseball and the great people of the Civil War? Those that rose above standards to do and produce something that was, in the eyes of everybody, extraordinary.
Well, I think that we can first quickly try to avoid cliches. They're not all black, they're not all white, they're not all rich, they're not all poor, they're not all from the north, they're not all from the south. They're not all men, they're not all women. So that we suddenly have a sort of an American portrait. And what we have are people who are in their being reconciling the things that most of us spend our time either in one thing or another. Oh, I don't like this, I do like this. They have come to see both sides and be able to speak it. Lincoln's genius is that they teach, as Shelby Foote told me, the Gettysburg Address in the schools in Mississippi when he's growing up. Now, the Gettysburg Address says that if his people succeeded in what his people wanted to do, it would be bad for humanity. And yet he's taught the sort of reconciling force, the poetry of this stuff. We have in the examples, I think it's less so in baseball because it is a sport, but we have the opportunity to see human bodies in motion, human physical athletic skills doing it, and then in the course of the narrative of baseball, some extraordinary individuals rising up, the complexity of a Ty Cobb or a Babe Ruth, particularly a Jackie Robinson or Kurt Flood, people that you're drawn to immediately because their stories, they know somewhere that 1 and 1 equals 3.
1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 3.
Yeah.
Also, they don't mind practicing. I'll tell you that first. They don't mind practicing. My father told me one time, son, you want to be different from everybody else, do something they don't want to do.
Yeah, you've lived that. You've really lived that.
Work hard.
Yeah,
they practice 3 hours, you practice 6. Now, you'll do it for a week, but let me see you come to me after 10 years of doing it. Then you'll know something that anyone who has not done that does not know. Charlie Parker was known to be a practicer. Duke Ellington, man, you know, how did he find the time just physically write all that music down? If it was sad, it takes forever.
Guess who else? Tiger Woods.
Everybody.
You know, I think about him all the time. He practiced today.
Yeah.
Walter Johnson going out and pinching, 1,000 balls.
We got a few minutes left for this hour. Billie Holiday.
I listen to her all the time. Whenever you say Billie Holiday, I think of Solitude, Duke Ellington's tune, which is her sort of masterpiece, and the kind of ability to take, it's the same thing, the ability to take just exactly who you are and understand the way, and this is an utterly American invention. It's an art, and so we've shared it with the world, so Wynton's right, it's all over the world, but this is what we suggested in the course of human events that could be done. People could govern themselves, those 4 pieces of paper, the Constitution, that people could improvise a music, and that could be an art, that you could bring yourself the limitations of a vocal range, not as great as, say, Sarah Vaughan's or Ella Fitzgerald, but she could put into that Billie Holiday. And it turns out that what this American thing is, when Wynton says, when he's looking at these kids, and he has to love them. He has to love every single one of them, the loud one, the obnoxious one, the quiet one, all of that, that this is our story. This is what we've said to humankind. This is what will distinguish us from all over, is that every individual matters, and that every individual can make art out of themselves if they are honest and true and willing to take the incredibly courageous stand of not just being the one thing or the other, but have that mitigating wisdom to see both. Then we're running on all cylinders.
You want to add anything to Billie Holiday? Or
Just say that she was a very modern person, and all of that Uncle Tom, Jim Crowism, and all that struck her very hard. She had a hard life already with her social condition. She was a woman of tremendous dignity and pride, and the affronts of that system, she didn't stand for it. She was a very modern person.
Why do we think of jazz and drugs so often?
The tragedy of Charlie Parker is that we have missed what this man who died at 34 could have done had he not, in his personal life, ravaged his body with drugs. We can understand how creative people, perhaps more, I don't know the statistics, are susceptible to these sorts of temptations because of how difficult it is to lead that kind of creative life, the kind of edge that you have. But Charlie Parker's genius has nothing to do with heroin.
Right, and to have the intelligence that he had and have to live in the system that he lived in. Now, he was used to that system, but he could see all the hypocrisy in it, and it hit him not so much for what happened to him, but for what he could see around him happening to everybody else and to the nation that he grew. There's a lot of things in his growing up, very ambiguous things that he had to always say, well, okay, what is this and what is that? And he became addicted to drugs young. But now we have the years that since he's passed, and we can safely say of all the people who got high, none of them played like him. So the moral of that is, you can get high if you want, but you're not going to play like Charlie Parker.
All right, one last look. A look at jazz today from the final installment. This is episode 10, a masterpiece by midnight.
There's a lot happening with the combination of jazz with R&B, jazz with Latin music, jazz with West Indian music, jazz with gospel music, jazz with hip-hop. But ultimately what matters is the emotional power of the music.
So I conclude by asking both of you the contribution of jazz to beyond itself.
Well, we haven't used it for what it is yet. It's going to help us to understand who we are. And it's going to function like our mythology. And when it functions like that, its contribution will be unbelievable.
I think that it is a window in which we can see clear into the center of us. I think it's a mirror that's reflected back at us where we've been, good and bad. And I think in some ways it has this prism, this thing that refracts all of our tendencies, so that you can find in jazz, in the same way that Blake said you could find the universe in a grain of sand, there is a sense of our American promise embedded in this very simple thing of a few people getting together, and one person is playing one thing and one person is playing another, and third is doing something like this conversation, and you have an American art and now a world art that I think will light us down in honor to the latest generations.
Jazz begins airing on January 8th at 9 p.m. on PBS, a 10-part series. It will air throughout the month of January. The accompanying book, which we have talked about, is called Jazz, A History of America's Music, Jeffrey C. Ward and Ken Burns. Also, there is, and I mention this because it is all part of the story of jazz to read, to listen to. Ken Burns' Jazz, A Story of America's Music. But I cannot recommend, nor have most people who have looked at this more as America, as the story of genius and the story of conflict and the story of evolution of something that is so uniquely who we are and what we can become. Thank you for joining us. See you next time here. Congratulations.
Thank you.
This is unbelievable. And you too. I mean, this is a story that you must have dreamed would be told.
Definitely.
Dreamed. Growing
Definitely.
up, I mean.
Well, much later.
Yeah,
Not so
much
much
later.
when I grew up, because I didn't know the history of it either, but later, after, when I was in my 20s, yeah, definitely.
What is it, notwithstanding that you played a part, but what is it that you think makes this? What is it that we get from this that you think is important to tell?
I think the sense of the people that made the music unencumbered by the cliches that have always attended the discussion of their achievements. And really the pacing of it, so much went into making it. He had a whole army of people up in Walpole. I mean, it was unbelievable going to the house, you know. And also you get to hear the musicians play.
Yeah, you do.
You get to hear them. You get to hear Charlie Parker play. You get to hear Monk. You get to hear Louis Armstrong. You get to.
What is amazing for me is that it is a continuum, and there were relationships, and you double back sometimes. We'll introduce a character.
Soundtrack. So he says that thing, then we do an interview with Gerald Early in baseball. This unbelievable thing he says that works its way into the introduction of baseball. He said that when they study our American civilization 2,000 years from now, we Americans will be known for only three things: the Constitution, baseball, and jazz music. And I'm going, he's saying that the genius of this country is in improvisation. Constitution's 4 pieces of paper, that's it. Baseball's a simple children's stick and ball game with infinite chess-like combinations. And at the heart of the only art form Americans have invented is this notion that I do not have to play the notes on the page. I can play who I am, and in telling you honestly who I am, that will be the art, and that will be an amazing American art. And when you realize that the themes that I've been interested in, particularly race, are all brought along, because the great, wonderful poetic justice of jazz is that the only art form Americans have invented that will commend us down through the years to posterity in the best light is a music born primarily in a community that has the historical memory of being unfree in a supposedly free land. You know, as Wynton says in the film, it's the story of Cinderella, the person that you keep out of the ball.
With his latest documentary, Jazz, Ken Burns, is once again taking on a uniquely American subject. The creator of documentaries on the Civil War and baseball has this time constructed a series on the art form that gave us Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. The film also uses jazz as a prism to explore such subjects as race, sexuality, and the rise of the American city in the 20th century. Time magazine wrote this week, quote, "Nothing else on television has ever sounded as good as jazz. It is great television about great music." Here is a scene from the series.
Jazz, the drummer Art Blakey liked to say, washes away the dust of everyday life. Above all, it swings.
Jazz premieres on PBS stations January 8th. The 10 episodes will air throughout the month. Joining me now, Ken Burns, the director and producer of the series, and Wynton Marsalis, jazz musician and senior creative consultant for the film. I'm pleased to have both of them. And then later we'll find more about how she knew what the relationships were, how these people played together, how one built on what the other had done, how one decided to go in a whole different direction. But they knew each other. This is a community of people over a period of time new and learn from each other.
Absolutely. I mean, we have a situation here where when you try to describe music, it's almost impossible. It's like trying to get the soap in the bathtub. And I think telling a narrative story, being wedded to finding out about human beings, means you're obligated to a very complex narrative which plants a seed in episode 2 about Artie Shaw that's not going to really pay dividends until episode 5 when Artie Shaw is struggling with his own success and the commercialization of swing. But you understand that as he goes through his early biography, he's going and hearing Louis Armstrong at the Savoy in Chicago and hearing him play West End blues, and that's going to change the way Artie Shaw is. Artie Shaw at one point in our film says that I had a choice. He said I wasn't happy with my life. I had a choice between getting a machine gun or getting an instrument, and he got an instrument.
Wow.
And that's the sort of story you want to tell, the kind of connection that you want to forge with it.
Some are describing this as Ken Burns' American trilogy, Civil War, baseball, and jazz.
It is, and I wish I could say I planned it from the beginning. I did the Civil War. It's the defining moment in American history. As I was working on baseball, I realized that I was working on the sequel to baseball, which sort of surprised me. That if the Civil War defined us, we tend to see our history as a political military narrative, you know, wars and generals and presidents, and that's it. And we forget that so much of who we are comes from other things that are going to ooze out of things like baseball, you know, race, the nature of heroes, popular culture and advertising, great cities, you know, all the wonderful things that baseball carries along in its wake. Two things happened while I was working on baseball that convinced me that it wasn't this moment and a sequel. I gave a speech about the Civil War, and Wynton was sitting in the front row, and after it was done, it's like 91, just after the Civil War came out, he said, you know, you should do something about jazz. And I kind of went, yeah.
This was 91?
91. You should do something about jazz. And I'd been using jazz music. I didn't know much about it. I'm a child of rock and roll and R&B. And I worked in a record store for 4 years, and I knew all this stuff, but it wasn't my music. But I was beginning to use jazz more and more as the soundtrack to all these American subjects. It was working. It is our